Welcome. Welcome, everybody, to Science on Tap. Thanks for coming. My name is Carol Warden. Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, an idea conceived in 1905 that the borders of the university are the borders of the state. Our partners in Science on Tap include Minocqua Public Library, Lakeland chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, UW Kemp Natural Resources Station, UW Trout Lake Station, Oak Fire Pizza, and WXPR Public Radio. Science on Tap is supported through a grant from the Brittingham Fund to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We have 3 ways to watch. You can join us right here in person, as some of you are. You can also watch online on our live YouTube page, and you can access that through our website, scienceontapminocqua.org. Or you can watch an event later. You can go to that website of ours and click on Watch Archived Videos. Our next event is Thursday, March 2nd, and it'll be held right here at Oak Fire Pizza, and we will have scientist Jim Head talking about astronomy. Tonight is a special night. It is our 10-year anniversary of Science on Tap. February of 2013 is when this all started. Thank you. And that is why you all get the ice cream treats as well tonight. So you chose a good night to come. And a fun fact, our very first Science on Tap, the directors of Trout Lake Station and Kemp Natural Resources Station were our guests. So the directors then and now is sort of almost a coincidence that we've gotten them both on the 10-year anniversary mark. And we'll see what's changed maybe in the last 10 years. So tonight, we have Dr. Scott Bovey and Dr. Gretchen Garish to tell us about research being done at the UW field stations that they direct. Scott is a professor of wood products in the Department of Forestry and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He earned his PhD in forest products from Virginia Tech and a Master in Science in Forest Products from the University of Minnesota, and a Bachelor of Science in Forest Science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Scott works closely with the wood products industry in Wisconsin and neighboring states. His current projects focus on forest product markets, wood manufacturing process improvements, and applications for hardwood vacuum drying, all strategies for remaining competitive with a global forest products marketplace. Scott and his family moved to northern Wisconsin in 2015, where he is serving as director of Kemp Natural Resources Station, a research station in the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences dedicated to forestry and natural resources. Gretchen serves as the director of Trout Lake Station, which is one of 2 field stations associated with UW-Madison's Center for Limnology. The other is on the shore of Lake Mendota on the Madison campus. She began her limnological journey in the late 90s as a summer intern at Trout Lake Station while completing her undergraduate degree at Lawrence University. She has a Master in Science in Natural Resources and Environmental Science from the University of Illinois and a PhD in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from Cornell University. She joined Trout Lake Station in June of 2019 after serving 9 years as a professor at UW-La Crosse. Gretchen's research focuses mostly on microscopic invertebrates that are essential linkages in our regional lakes. She's worked continuously in both freshwater and marine systems to study how ecological and evolutionary timescales interact to influence the aquatic ecosystems over time. Keywords for Gretchen include wife, mother, daughter, director, friend, researcher, and administrator. Per our tradition, we have trivia for Scott and Gretchen, but it's a little bit different take this time as well. I've got a few fun facts about both of them, and you have to guess which one the fact belongs to. Number 1, this person was an animal lover from the start and always cared for them, including wildlife such as raccoons, and even named one of their pet raccoons Pete. Was it Gretchen or Scott? Gretchen. As a young child, this person took pride in having an arm span wider than the chimps and orangutans at the zoo. Scott. I say all the better to measure DBH on trees, right? This person had their marriage proposal occur as a surprise during their graduate student speech at their graduation ceremony. I only heard one answer so far. Also, Scott, 2,000 people thought he was the most romantic person ever when he proposed to his wife unexpectedly during his speech. Okay, this person had botfly larvae burrow into their back while working in a remote part of a tropical forest. It's Gretchen. And then to top it off, she ended up having a massage with some friends, and the oil started suffocating the botflies, and they burrowed even deeper into her skin. It was a story I had to share. Now, Dr. Gretchen Garish and Scott Bovey.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Carol. I really like sharing that. Welcome, and thanks for the opportunity to come and join you tonight. It is fun to be here for the 10th year of this event. It seems incredible to have the audience and the interaction and participation for that duration. So I think Scott and I are going to kick off and kind of split time, just spend a little time giving you an overview of what's happening at the stations. And I'm going to let Scott start.
That's great. So neither one of us were here 10 years ago, so it's hard to really think back and compare what happened 10 years ago. But I'll tell you a little bit of the history of Kemp Station and some of the things that are going on today. So how many people here in the room have been to Kemp Station before? Good number of you. We are a little bit different setup than Trout Lake. We're one of 12 ag research stations in the College of Ag at the Madison campus. Now, most of the other ag stations have to do with traditional ag, whether it be, agronomics, dairy cows, whatever. We tend to focus on natural resources. So we're unique in that way. We don't have silos and barns. We have forests and lakes at our station. So the Kemp Station was actually gifted to the university in 1960. And when the university got it, they really didn't know what to do with it. They thought, well, maybe the folks over in CALS can use it because it was similar to the other ag stations that CALS already had. So that's how CALS ended up with the property. And at that time, it's a bit of a shadow of what it is today. We have a lot of new amenities that we didn't have back in 1960, but without a doubt, it was a fantastic gift from the Kemp family, the namesake. So if you're familiar with Kemp Street down in Rhinelander, that was named after the Kemp family. No relation to the ice cream people. This Kemp family made their money in storm doors and stove boards. What are stove boards? Anybody know? Stove boards are similar to the stamped metal that we have on the ceiling. They were metal panels that you would put behind your stove to reflect the heat off the wall so your wood stoves wouldn't catch your wall on fire. Those are stove boards. So who would have known that screen doors and stove boards could make a lot of money? But that was the case. The Kemp company was originally in Indiana, and they moved up to Rhinelander to be closer to the forest resource. So that's how the family ended up in this area with their production facility in Rhinelander. Mr. Kemp, he wanted to have a fishing camp because he enjoyed fishing on Tomahawk Lake. In the Lake Tomahawk area is where he stayed. So he actually bought the first 100 acres of Kemp Station for $150 in 1920. So right there is a perfect example of what inflation is.
That's crazy.
From $150 to the millions that it's worth today. But unfortunately, Mr. Kemp never had the opportunity to enjoy Kemp Station as it is or as it was, because he actually died before the fishing camp was built. It's his wife and daughter that actually built the camp after Edward's death. And they actually enjoyed that area for decades until really into the 50s. And at that point, the daughter had two children, Susan and Sally, and then they had grown families and they had all moved away, and they just didn't use Kemp like they used to, so they started looking for an opportunity to to give Kemp away, and that's how the university acquired the property. Since that time, we've expanded quite a bit. We actually have a new dormitory that we added about 15 years ago, and then we added a new small classroom, small conference facility that we added just back in 2018. So our facility now is really a great place for the things that we do, the research, the teaching, the outreach. We have 65 beds on station, so our busy season, of course, is during the summer when a lot of times all of those beds are full. In the winter, we're a lot quieter. We actually, this year, do have several long-term researchers that are staying in our one dormitory that we leave open year-round. So we do have activity year-round, but the main summer field season is our busiest time. And I did mention those three items that are really part of our mission. The research, because we are technically an ag research station, so there's research in our mission of what we do. And that has a lot to do with various forest and wildlife projects that go on. I can talk more about those later. But we also have the teaching aspect. During any given summer, we'll have 12 to 15 actual classes that we teach at Kemp Station. So these are 4-credit classes that you would take through UW-Madison, but they're just hosted up here at Kemp, which is a wonderful experience. Any student that comes to Kemp for a class remembers Kemp for the rest of their life. And that was actually my first introduction to Kemp was as a student many years ago when I was a forestry student. And then another part I'd like to mention is the outreach that we do. And this is an example of what we're doing tonight, this type of thing. We're involved in community outreach. We'll have a number of programs throughout the summer, whether it's Fungi Fest or Insect Fest, where we talk about those various topics. But we also do small conferences. One of the conferences we just had last fall was with a group that I'm involved with. I think you heard mention that I work with kilns, lumber dry kilns in the forest industry. So we had a big group up there that focused on that aspect. And then just the other day we met about an upcoming conference this next fall called Science in the Northwoods that will sort of speed dating for scientists where you get up and give a 5-minute presentation of what you're working on, and then it's a great networking opportunity for you to work with other people that work in those same fields. So that's an example of conferences that we do. So that's kind of Kemp in a nutshell, and I'll be happy to answer questions a little bit later after you talk about Trout Lake in a nutshell. How's that?
Great, thanks. Yeah, so as Scott mentioned, the Kemp Station is in the College of Ag. Trout Lake Station is the only station for the College of Letters and Sciences. And so we're housed within the Center for Limnology, which is a group that focuses on water and water resources throughout the state. And there's 2 facilities, the one down on the shore of Madison, and then Trout Lake, which is on the south shore of Trout Lake, just up north of here in Boulder Junction. So how many folks have been to Trout Lake Station? Okay. So we will celebrate our 100-year anniversary in 2025. So the station was originally established in 1925 by Edward Burge and Chauncey Juday. Edward Burge started leading research up on the shores of Trout Lake, and during that period it was on the northern shore of the South Basin of Trout Lake, which is now where the Forestry DNR headquarters is. And it's called Trout Lake Station because it was associated with the railway at that time. And the original labs were 4 older buildings that were named fish, chemistry, plankton. Which one am I missing? Bacteriology. So we had 4 buildings that each acted as a lab, and then a big building called the House of Lords where the researchers would stay, and then people that were supporting the station at that time would camp out around the area and support the researchers that came through. And I always think it's interesting to think about what it looked like in the 1920s up in this area. A lot of trees being cut, a lot of clearing, but access to the lakes, probably not these great boat launches that we have today, right? And you think about the vehicle and access to these. The team of Burge and Juday and their graduate students sampled over 500 lakes throughout the region during that stretch of time. And their philosophy was that if you gather enough information, they'll teach you. And so they sampled a bunch of lakes and really came up with some of the foundational principles of what we call now limnology, or the study of freshwater. And so you can find figures from the work that they did in this region in textbooks, fundamental equipment that we still use models of today are still being used internationally in the field of limnology. So we really consider the Center for Limnology, Zoology at UW-Madison as one of the birthplaces of this science. And many of you who may have ties to UW recognize the name Burge, or even if you're associated with Madison. Not only was he a lover of all things microscopic plankton, he loved working on Daphnia and was one that helped to describe many of the early species from the region and throughout the US. But he also served as on some of the foundational groups that formed the USGS, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and as president of the UW for a period, and started the Department of Zoology for UW-Madison. The list is really immense, so he was very active throughout the state in lots of environmental areas of research and science and management. And so that history is interesting to bring forward because some of those original samples still guide the long-term perspective that we apply to research at the station today. In the 1960s, they acquired the piece of land that's on the south shore of Trout Lake. And one of my favorite pictures in my head is how they took those cabins. It sounds like they put them on giant sliders and they slid them across the ice to where we now use them. We transitioned them into housing. And those cabins are available for our researchers during the summer months. And so in the 1960s, we built the lab where it now sits. And that lab, Art Hassler was one of the researchers that came in during that time. And he had been a student with Burge and Judet. But his approach to science was quite different. He was very experimental. And so in comparison to Burge and Judet, who really did a lot of observational work and collection of data, he wanted to work, like a lot of ecological research at that time, moved into an experimental phase. And so he implemented whole lake experiments. He had some famous experiments up in the University of Notre Dame Environmental Research Center lakes, where they added nutrients and looked at nutrient interactions. They worked on liming to change the conditions of the water quality. And so these whole lake manipulations were another form of science where huge amounts of data were collected, and we really got a picture of ecosystem change. He also was active at the same time as Aldo Leopold was bringing conservation and science really together in terms of applied research. And so that carried into the community of practice during what sometimes we refer to as the Hassler stretch. In the 1980s, one of the big events for the station happens that still influences today, and that was that John Magnuson, who was then the director for the center, participated with a nationwide group at the National Science Foundation to establish a program called LTER, or Long-Term Ecological Research Program. And the Long-Term Ecological Research Program is a network of 28 sites, I think it is now. At the time it started, I think it was closer to 6 or 8. And the vision of that program in the 1980s was that these are the sites where we're going to begin to understand long-term change. Because in order to really have that appreciation, we need knowledge that carries back beyond the immediacy of the experiments that we can do. And so LTER established in 1981 and has been a core source of data collection. The crew, including Carol Warden, who's right here, and some of the other folks that are helping up top, participate in sampling 5 lakes and 2 bogs within the region that have been sampled every 2 weeks, every summer, for around 42 going on 43 years. And then in the winter, either quarterly or every month, as long as the ice is safe. And that data set is used internationally as one of the records that helps us to think about things like climate change, adaptation, ecosystem variability. And so LTR continues to be a huge part of what we do and often scaffolds some of the projects that we have going on station right now. So just a few highlights of the current research. So based on that LTR data, one of the patterns that has emerged is the variability in ice-off date. And you don't need a ton of data if you live up here to know that we're seeing big differences. And so climate models predict, and the ice data predict or fit, that we're losing ice days, right, over time. And so over the last 100 years or the last 40 years up here that we have record, we've lost about 10 days of ice. And while that, might not seem as alarming, what has happened is in the last 10 years, the year-to-year variation in ice off has increased by 5-fold. And last year and the last 2 years are a good example where we had almost 30-day difference in the ice off date. Last year was really late. We had a late ice off, and the year before that it was in March. I don't know if you guys remember that. 2012, 2013 is another example where it was 50-day difference between the ice off date. And so right now we're really actively pursuing what that means for the organisms that live in the lakes, their interactions, and the ecosystem function. And so we think about that as phenology of the lake. So the ice goes out, you expect fish to spawn. The plankton that I work on have these boom and bust cycles. And when you have this dynamic uncoupled from what it was in the past, sometimes those food web structures or the ability to reproduce successfully become offset. And so we're actively investigating that as part of a project right now. Ice and winter, we do have some winter work, although we do have a seasonal summer boon of influx of researchers. Our winter work is also continuing to grow. In the last couple years, we had a project where they went out and looked at the interaction between the amount of snow and the ice. If you go out right now, it's pretty slushy. We don't have a ton of ice set on the lakes. And so looking at the interaction of snow and ice formation, so they actually went out to South Sparkling Bog, which is just up Highway 51 here, and they snowplowed the bog every winter for 2 straight winters, and they looked at how the ice formed when it had snow and when it didn't have snow. And they looked at what happened underneath the ice. If you have a bunch of snow over the top, it means you have less light, but you also have that cold air hitting directly on the ice. So they looked at things like how much algae was produced under the ice, what that meant for the plankton that was living there, and what that meant for the ice formation and the breakup of that ice throughout the season. So that was an interesting project, and the answer is it also changes based on the amount it snows every year and when the ice sets in. So learning those dynamics so that you can understand the lakes throughout all the seasons. Like Scott probably could attest to, there's always a ton of projects that come through station. We probably have 15 or 16 annually, big scale, and then the students come in the summer with lots of ideas on their own that we help to mentor them through. And so we have about 48 beds on station. During the winter, we host conferences and school groups. And then in the summer, we're really full of research students, both graduate students, technicians, and undergraduates. And so that's some of the research, just a couple of very brief highlights. I'm happy to answer questions because you've probably heard about other projects if you want to ask those. And we also love doing outreach events. We have this program, and then another one that's really been building in the last couple years is called Drawing Water. We just added a next generation to that, so we have art students that come and are paired with a science mentor and an art mentor to help us communicate our science. We partner with North Lakeland Discovery Center on that one, the Lac du Flambeau Tribal Natural Resources, Wisconsin DNR Fisheries Research Unit, and that's a fun project that continues to go this summer. So we'll be disseminating and having art displays coming in the next year or so in pairing with some of our artists in residence, as well as the art students that are participating. So, is that enough? Well, I'd love to hear some questions.
Yes, we'll open the floor up to questions, and Amber will bring the mic around. We'll open the floor to questions. Amber will bring the mic around. Please feel free to talk directly into it, and they'll adjust upstairs. Don't be scared that you're too loud.
Recently, we're seeing a few papers show up about bioaccumulation of forever-type chemicals. We know that in northern Wisconsin, we've documented mercury accumulations and stuff. Is there any plan to look at that up here and come up with established, safe limits for consumption, et cetera?
Yeah, I think that those forever chemicals are definitely of concern. The history of mercury is one that Carl Watrous, who was at the station, was very involved in measuring, and we received guidelines, and it was very alarming when that happened, and the information came out, and the recommendations were made. And we've learned to, moderate consumption and to manage that in lakes, but it's also something that happens both naturally and because of human input. The forever chemicals are definitely the hot topic in toxicology right now, and the forever part of it, I think, is what has people really worked up, is that it doesn't go away and just continues to grow. I think there's a lot of questions. There was a recent paper that just came out giving fish consumption information in 2020. It just came out last year, where these chemicals are making their way into fish and then can make their way into human diets. And so I don't know if folks know about these, but there are other ways people refer to them are PFOS or PFOS. These are chemicals that are found a lot in firefighting agents, so a lot of the sprays that they use for firefighting. It's also used to make your pans not stick. If you're wearing waterproof clothing, I'm sorry, you probably got a bunch of PFOS that washed off there or that was in there. And so we've been using them for a long time, and they've been present for a long time. And I think that the levels that they're activating these warnings on are very, very low. I don't know if they have as much information about the lakes in northern Wisconsin, especially because it can vary from very localized to widespread. And so the recommendations that came out in the 2022 paper about fishes had only a handful of sampling in Wisconsin. I don't know the exact number because like the Great Lakes, they sampled pretty heavily, but the inland lakes of Wisconsin weren't heavily sampled. So there's definitely plans to sample for PFAS is the short answer to your question. But the DNR is working on it. I just met with Tribal Natural Resources and the Great Lakes Intertribal Commission that are really active because there's a lot of consumption within those communities that are interested in testing. And there's researcher Christy Remicall with LTR that's been working on it throughout the state. So I think we're going to see a lot more about those. That's what I've got for now. But people are working on it. They want to be able to tell, but I'm not sure we have enough information to know how alarmed to be yet in these waters.
Well, while we wait, while you all think, I have an online question. How does the approach to the study of environmental science differ between the College of Agriculture and the College of Letters and Science?
Well, I think there's a lot of overlap because if you look at my college, it has agriculture in the title, but there's forest and wildlife ecology, there's a host of other departments that are really made up of ecologists. So I suspect that some of the people that work at Trout Lake overlap with my college and vice versa.
Yeah, for sure. Users of the stations, I think, go back and forth.
Yes.
And I do agree that it's really just the oversight structure, but the use of them crosses both fields pretty readily.
Not to push traditional ag off to the side because we all like to eat, me especially, but certainly if you look at my college, there's 16 departments. There's probably maybe 6 of them that are focused on traditional ag. So it's not as big a component as maybe it was back when the college was founded.
Yeah, and integrative biology is where the faculty for the Center for Limnology are housed, and that crosses things like botany includes this close ties with botany. It has a lot of evolutionary biologists as well as ecologists, and so that unit alone has a pretty good breadth within the LNS. But I think some of them could well apply for some of the ecological jobs in the CALS units.
This is a question for Scott. As a forester, I have to ask, steel or Husqvarna?
Well, honestly, I personally own a steel, but we have a Husqvarna at work, so I get to work with both saws. Was that too much of a politician answer?
Question for Gretchen. Gretchen, what are you seeing in studies up there in Trout Lake with chloride off the road, this road salt and bromine and some of that coming into the lakes? Any research being done on that?
There's a ton being done in Madison with Hillary Dugan, who's in our group at the Center for Limnology. And I don't know if you're watching right now, but Madison just had their Saltwise Week where they're advocating for the city. The city's actually paused using a lot of salt, but UW-Madison's still loading it up. And so if you follow Hillary Dugan on Twitter, you can see regular pictures of piles of salt down in Madison and a lot of feedback on the harms that that's causing. And so the numbers on some of the southern lakes is really substantial. I don't have the exact scale, but it's one of those curves that goes like this, all the way up in terms of salt, many multiple times what it is over the years. And we do see some of that here in the region. This summer, Noah, who's hiding upstairs, had a student that was working on looking at chloride levels in invert communities as a small side project. And so, and found that some of the lakes in closer proximity to the county highways had higher salt concentrations than they have in the past 20, like it's been increasing over the last 20 years. So we do have some of that long-term data to ask that more substantially in these LTR lakes. We are seeing changes and information is very preliminary on it, but it seems that it has to do with proximity to some of the major roads. So I think there's lots of room for exploration, but right now in the southern part of the states where there's a little bit more development in close proximity, a lot more roads and concrete feeding right into the waters, it's a pretty big concern in terms of changing both the chemistry, and many of the little guys that I work on, the plankton, are very susceptible to low levels of salt. So it's a good question. Yeah.
You're ready?
Sure. I know that there was some evidence found of emerald ash borer up in the Muckwa Barrens. I was wondering if there was anything going on in the forest down here that you guys had found.
Well, I don't know the exact map in my head, but I know it's, hasn't it been found in Rhinelander as well? So that's not too far away. So, a number of years ago, we used to be quarantined by county in the state when it comes to emerald ash borer. They got rid of that and we're one giant state now as far as where the boundaries are because it's sort of inevitable, the spread of emerald ash borer. So it's not a matter of if it will, it's just a matter of when it will. And most foresters now, if you have a significant component of ash in woodland property that you own, that would be something to consider in your management plan to say, okay, if I'm going to do a harvest, I might as well take the ash now so that there is some revenue value from that ash versus letting it die by the insect itself.
Yeah, I got a question on brine versus salt. We now see trucks from Oneida County and Vilas County spreading what they call brine. It's water and salt mix on the roads, and I wonder how much of that gets into the lakes compared to regular salt. They just had a thing on this morning on the radio when I was coming into town about 1 teaspoon of salt in a 5-gallon pail makes it salt water that can never be taken out. Now, the problem is with the brine, it seems to rust out vehicles a heck of a lot faster than the other salt did. Is there any research that's been done with this kind of stuff?
I don't know. I'm not aware of anyone looking at the difference between brine application and salt. Doesn't mean it's not out there. When I think of the way that the salt gets into like a lake, it's going in an aqueous, like it gets dissolved and then runs into the water. So I think it would have more to do with if the brine, like asking how much salt's actually in the brine compared to what a chunk salt would be, right? Are concentrations less in the brine? Because either way, it's going to end up being watered down salt that runs into the lakes. And so I guess the question that I would have there is, are they just using less salt because it's already brined and it's spreading farther? So I don't have a good answer, but that's where I kind of think about it. Right? Are they using less salt because it's already in a liquid form and they can spread it more?
This question is more for Gretchen, I think. But I worked at Voyageurs National Park where there was a huge issue with invasive cattails. I was wondering if there's an issue with those here in Wisconsin in inland lakes, or if there's an issue with other invasive marsh plants.
Yeah. I think plants are one of the most common conversations that comes to station from folks that live on lakes. I mean, fish and plants. And cattails do occur in a number of water bodies and can kind of push in on the shorelines. We don't hear about cattails as frequently as Eurasian water milfoil, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. That's one of the invasives that grows and kind of swamps out the surface waters, and people don't like boating through it, and it can be hard to get rid of once it's established. Curly leaf pondweed is another one that can come in there and do the same. Of course, our good friend purple loosestrife habitats and is a consider, and then the yellow iris, I think, is another one that shares habitats with the blue iris, which is considered to be local or well established. And so I don't know the scale of the cattail issue, but I do know there's some water bodies where it's more influential than others. Susan Knight could probably fill us in if you still have questions. She's here too and has worked on aquatic plants in the area for a long time. So, yeah.
I had a question if there's any research going on with bats. I know I'd heard a lot about white nose fungus, so yeah.
Well, I can answer a little bit about that. At Kemp Station, we actually have a bat monitoring station, and it uses, basically it measures the frequencies that bats sound to determine the number and what potentially type of bat is flying in that area. So it's actually in one of our forested areas that actually had a blowdown a number of years ago, so the trees are back from the tower, and then when the bats are out feeding at night, that tower can actually pick up based on their echolocation. Anecdotally, we have a boathouse on Kemp Station that's right over the water, and on any given night in the summer, you could go down at dusk and count 80 bats or more that fly out from the boathouse under the doors to go out and feed. The last couple years when we had our wildlife camp up there, just 2 years ago we found 2 bats in the boathouse. I mean, it is a significant drop in the number. I'm not a wildlife expert. That's the little I know about bats. One interesting thing, and I don't know how this has been tested, there have been some studies in the southeastern part of the U.S. where they used different fungicide chemicals that would actually effectively reduce the growth of the fungus on the bat. And it's actually a common pesticide that you would use to keep fruit fresh longer. So to keep your fruit from turning bad, growers would use this to maintain the shelf life of fruit. And they found that if you could atomize this into the hibernaculum that the bats would be in, that could help reduce the impact of white nose. Whether that's realistic, that you can go out to these various hibernaculums and atomize this material, I don't know if that's the case or not. So that's all I know about white nose syndrome. let me tell you one thing before I forget, because I forgot to mention it earlier. If you're interested in wildlife, we are having a mini wildlife symposium this Saturday, so day after tomorrow at Kemp Station starting at 9 a.m. One of my colleagues in the department, Tim Van Dielen, his students are going to be up, and they're going to talk about the research that they're doing in the, so if you come out to Kemp, it's in the Connor Forestry Center, follow the signs, you drive right back there from 9 to about 11, and Tim promised me they're going to talk about elephants, they're going to talk about cranes, they're going to talk about deer, they're going to talk about airplanes. All of this and more will be at the Mini Wildlife Symposium.
So it's not mini wildlife.
No, they're
It's
not
a
small
mini-
because
It's a mini symposium.
it's a mini symposium because elephants would not be classified as mini.
Just make,
Yes. Poor sentence structure on my part.
just confirm.
Question, have you seen any decline in our wetlands due to climate change?
I think that's a challenging question. That's why I paused, because lakes in this area are always changing. And so especially some of the smaller wetlands and bogs, right? Their natural succession is to grow in and to fill in some of that water. And so I don't want to overstep and attribute those rates to climate change. I don't know if we have direct evidence that that's accelerating with climate change. I guess when I think of filling in of wetlands, we often talk more about shoreline development and land use in terms of wetland loss, and that doesn't mean climate's not impacting them. I guess I just I haven't had direct conversation or read about that scaling in proportion to kind of the natural succession of some of the bogs that I think of, or fens that I think of around here, but that's a good question. Definitely more development, shoreline, and eutrophication, adding nutrients so that those things grow faster, probably are having bigger impacts. Yeah.
I have an online question for Scott, but before I ask, is it fungi or fungi?
Depends on how you tell the joke.
All right, our question. I attended a wonderful fungi fest last year at Kemp. Thanks. Is there much research occurring about fungi, including the health of forest ecosystems?
Well, the Fungi Fest is one of our outreach events I mentioned earlier, and that is one of our most popular outreach events. It's several days where people come. We have some expert foragers that you get to go out around the station, collect various fruiting bodies, bring them back, and they'll talk about each fruiting body, the one that you shouldn't have touched, that kind of thing, right? So that's a very popular program. There's very informative for people that are interested in foraging. You know, there's the story that there are old fungi foragers and there are bold fungi foragers, but there are no old, bold fungi foragers. So those are some of the things you could learn at that event. As far as some of the research that I know about fungi, actually a recently retired professor in my department, Glenn Stanos, did a lot of work with forest pathology. So he looked at how do fungi impact forests or various tree species, and it did a number of projects over the years looking at the decline in certain forest types because of certain fungi. And again, I don't have a lot of depth of knowledge there, but Glenn would love to talk to you about that if you had the opportunity or if you have questions about research specifically affecting forests in the state.
Okay, this is for Gretchen again. Obviously, Trout Lake is sitting on, a great oligotrophic lake, and you've got, it looks like some nets out there studying Corioganids. And the question is, with climate change and stuff, in the last few years, we've been seeing a lot of upper Midwest fisheries having problems with their cisco populations. What are you seeing on Trout Lake, and are you going to expand that research out onto those early, meso lakes that are probably even more stressed?
Yeah, there's a lot of Cisco work going on. Cisco is one of the fish that's monitored on Trout Lake every year in the long-term fisheries program. And they have very dynamic kind of boom and bust periods. We were just looking at this, and so they'll go and they'll be low for 5 to 8 years, and then they'll come back up really high. And some of that alternates with lake trout populations. And so Trout Lake is one that does have these kind of cyclical dynamics. And in that, it's hard to detect some of the longer term trends in their numbers within Trout Lake. For example, they've been really low for the last stretch, but according to one of our grad researchers who was out running some hydroacoustics, which is a sound wave model that helps us to detect Cisco, their numbers were really high this last summer in trout. So Cisco was really up in trout right now. And so the long-term trend is hard to detect because it is so variable on these long time scales. But Cisco have been lost from systems where other fish like invasive smelt come in, or they're not being kept. And so there's an active partnership with the DNR Fisheries group over at Escanaba. So Greg Sass heads that group up. And the grad researcher Joe Murnack has been working with them. They've been stocking Cisco from White Sand Lake up in Boulder Junction into Sparkling Lake and Crystal Lake to try to reestablish populations of Cisco in those lakes, and then to look at how, because the smelt numbers in those lakes are down due to removal that's been taking place over kind of the last 8 to 10 years. And so with the smelt numbers reduced, the goal is that if they reintroduce Cisco, maybe they can bring back that natural fish. That work is very actively in progress. They've done 2 seasons where they've added Cisco to the lakes, and now they're continuing to track how those Cisco are doing and what the overall food web is changing, right? Because you reintroduce a fish like that into a system, it can change a lot of the interactions that are going on. So it's a really active question area. And yes, there is interest to see if those Cisco, were outcompeted out and aren't going to come back because the habitats are no longer able to, or maybe if they get a good stronghold, they can reestablish. So that's a very active area of research in terms of Cisco. Trout, in terms of climate change and Cisco dynamics, a little harder to tell just because of that, right? When you're looking at 40 years of data and they're cycling on an 8 to 10 year cycle, you're only through 2 or 3 cycles. So it's a little challenging to state definitive climate with those patterns in trout. Yeah.
I just kind of a random wood products question. When I was in Sweden, I toured a church that was built from logs that were naturally preserved, I guess, by scouring the standing trees a few years in a row. So they would send up sap and resin and then cutting them down. And I wondered if anybody has ever attempted to do that here, if that's a thing, an alternative to green treating.
Well, that's interesting. Just using the natural resins in that particular species to increase its resistance. Not that I'm aware of here in the States. I mean, most of our treatment research over the years has been chemical based. So whether, the reason railroad ties last for so long is there's a lot of things that organisms don't like inside of railroad ties after they're treated. There's a number of other treatments that are quite benign to people, that borates, for example. So remember the Team Borate box of laundry detergent in the grocery store? That's an excellent wood preservative. However, it's not waterproof, so it's water soluble. So it actually, the rain, the thing that you don't want to get on it, will actually remove the preservative. One thing that's pretty interesting now, I believe, is heat treatment of wood. So you actually take domestic species like we have here, you put them in a specially designed kiln and you raise the temperature to extreme temperatures in the absence of oxygen. You actually change the cellular structure, actually the chemical structure of the wood. so that it's no longer palatable to fungi or insects. And you can have a chemical-free board after this process that you can use for decks or outdoor seating or exterior cladding on buildings that does not use chemicals. You're seeing more and more of that in Europe. There's dozens of manufacturers doing it's called thermally modified wood, because the European Union has more strict standards when it comes to chemical treatment than we do here in the States. It's becoming more popular in the U.S., and in fact, one of my projects yet for the station is we're adding benches around our campfire area, and that will be thermally modified wood because it's just a cool new product that I think is going to continue to grow.
Gretchen, is there any research being done as part of the research center up there in Trout Lake on underwater or underground, like our well water, and what some of the runoff does, like with the salts and the chlorine and bromine and some of the other stuff going in from the lakes and then getting into groundwater?
We continuously monitor groundwater wells associated with the LTER, but often those are decoupled from home sites. They're kind of groundwater adjacent to the lakes that we're monitoring. And so there's not any individual working on station right now on the groundwater, but we had a student that finished a couple years ago that was looking at it's a little bit different than your question, not well water runoff into systems currently. That always comes into some of the models that are being made, right? It's a parameter. But I do think those are biased by what's happening in the south of the state. And so it's a good question and probably could use more of that, not active at the station right now. But we did have a long-term grad student that was there for like 6 years, and he was looking at how water levels in the lakes and the trees interact. And so thinking about how lake level influences the strength of the trees, the sway dynamics of the trees, and how that water gets pulled up and put back in. And so there was a lot of interface between the lake and the trees along, and I think it was really interesting work that helped us to understand how to detect like severe lake level changes. He also could go in and bore those trees and get kind of water dynamics over a longer time scale, because he could ask the tree what the wet conditions were like during its lifespan. And so I think that's the kind of the big linkage that we've been looking at in terms of the interaction of the forest with the watersheds around it, and what that buffer, that riparian buffer, how that changes across that zone of no cutting or development along the shorelines. And so, yeah, he's pretty well finished. Most of his stuff has now been published, but it's still that information would be really available on station among the crowd there. Cool findings, yeah.
You know, there's that field station, or it used to be a field station, Pigeon Lake over by Drummond, and that's had dramatic changes in lake levels. And I don't know if Trout Lake, been involved with any of that, or?
We haven't, but I came from UW La Crosse, and that was the field station we used to go teach at, and they couldn't even get to the housing because the whole place was swamped out, and so the lake levels had come up so high.
In 20 years, it's gone from sort of what I remember as normal to extremely low to extremely high, and that's a pretty short period of time. Yeah.
And I think this grad student, the joke is that he came to study the effects of drought on the forest, and they were the 8 wettest years in history. Like we had like the wettest, highest water. So he got to really study the influence of high water on the forest and adapted very well to the new questions.
I have one more online question. What do you suggest is done to lessen the effects of wake boats on the Eagle River chain and other similar lakes and rivers?
Ooh. That's a loaded question. And I think it's a good question. And it was, I attended the Wisconsin Lakes Convention last year, and Governor Evers came and spoke, and that was the loudest question that was asked at that meeting of lake managers it's a concern in all parts of the state, but I think here where we have a huge range in the size of lakes, it is a very important question. I haven't worked on the Eagle River chain directly, but I do see the conversation very apparent in many lakes around here. Presque Isle, I know, has had a lot of conversation. And so I think that, I don't know what was the exact question? What are we going to do about it? How can we stop it or prevent shoreline damage?
What's done to lessen the effects?
I'll say that bigger lakes definitely have more space to absorb the impact of a wake boat, right? The impact of that wave as it can get kind of tamped down as you go toward the shoreline is a really big deal. And so smaller lakes are going to have a harder time than large lakes. We do know that aquatic plants are one of our greatest buffers for our shorelines, both the ones that are underwater as well as the ones that are emergent. And so as that water hits the shoreline, I mean, you can kind of think of anything. If the water has to force through something, right, it's going to sit down better if you have structure along that shoreline. And some folks love structure along their shoreline and others want to rip it out. And so I think structure being plants, yes, sorry, plant structure, not solid walls. Well, yeah, I'm talking about plant structures that are going to help to lessen that wave impact. But I think it's a really big question. It's a relatively new question. These boats are becoming more apparent. We see them on small lakes and big lakes up here, and I think there are more questions to be answered along that. So I don't have a straight up answer. Kind of circled around it there, and I admit that, but it's a big challenge, I think, and we'll need some decision making and leadership on how to manage that.
Hey,
Can I make a couple plugs?
absolutely.
Just as a couple plugs, I know I got at least one question beforehand. Trout Lake Station does hire an influx of undergraduate students each season, and those jobs are now posted and open through February 15th. So if you have young folks that are currently enrolled in school, take a look, and we'd be happy to entertain applications. We even have a few for recent graduates or technicians for short-term tech positions over the summer. And there's save-the-date cards for our summer open house. So if you want to come and get hands-on learning about some of the topics we've talked about, talk about experts, the Cisco project would be featured. We've got aquatic plants coming out. And so the open house is always a good chance. It's August 4th this coming summer. I know it's far away, but it's fun to think of what August 4th could look like wandering around outside at Trout. So,
Any plugs for you, Scott?
Well, watch our website for the outreach sessions we'll have this summer. We normally do a shiitake log outreach session where we teach people how to grow mushrooms on logs. That's the only mushroom I will forage because I'm not that bold, because I planted it in that log and I know what it looks like. We'll also be looking for Fungi Fest later in the fall, so keep an eye. We'd be happy to see you.
And Saturday.
And Saturday, I will also put the plug in, the mini symposium for the not-so-many animals. Elephants to cranes, Saturday, 9 a.m. at Kemp Station.
Well, thank you so much to Gretchen Garish and Scott Bovey. Thanks to everyone who participated, our sponsors, the Lakeland chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, Minocqua Public Library, UW Kemp Natural Resources Station, UW Trout Lake Station, WXPR Radio, and the Brittingham Foundation. Stay tuned for our next Science on Tap, which will be right here on March 2nd, Thursday, March 2nd, and we'll be hearing from Jim Head about astronomy. If you want to sign up for any email reminders for our events, you can go to our website and click Contact Us, or you can fill out your email address on the card on the back of the room. Thank you.